think Norman has always had a very considered view of what it is that he's doing. I think he's had that sense of purpose throughout his life, which has been about architecture, about building, about an optimistic view of what the world might be with design and architecture applied effectively. As a very young architectural journalist in the late 1970s, I remember the day, I was working for a magazine called Building Design at the time, and I can remember the day that the photographs of the Sainsbury Centre came into the office, and we were amazed. That was the first time I really felt conscious of the impact that Norman Foster could make. In the Britain of 1964, when Norman and Richard and Wendy and Sue started Team 4, a big studio was 25 people, and there was a big gap between the architecture of the establishment and what was called commercial architecture. And I think the way that Norman's worked has been to completely obliterate this gap. There is only architecture, there's good architecture and there's not so good architecture. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to be sent to Hong Kong for the Foster Associates team just before the building was actually complete. And I had a brief from Gordon Graham, who was at that time one of the management team at Foster's, to prepare the kind of information that journalists or writers might need for the opening of the official opening of the building. It was acknowledged to be the first serious piece of architecture that the colony had made for a very long time. It was breaking all the rules. It was made not in concrete but in steel. It was prefabricated, and it seemed to be entirely reinventing the idea of what a high-rise could be. Let's not forget that we were still at a time when the skyscraper, the high-rise, was fundamentally an American invention, and most European attempts to build high simply looked like feeble attempts to replicate Coca-Cola. And suddenly, here was Foster really taking the high-rise back to its roots, back to its origins, starting again. And that also felt extraordinarily exciting. Architects who build successful careers always find a way to surround themselves with the best possible people. Norman's idea was to bring into the team a structural expert, an engineering expert, a cost expert, and to make them part of his team, not to use them as outside consultants. I think that was a very important step. He always looked for fascinating, interesting collaborators. So one of the many people in the studio in the early days would be Jan Kaplitsky, and you can actually see that imagination. Jan and Norman shared a love for cars, aeroplanes, technology. They dreamed of going to space, and in some ways I think they shared that sense of what architecture could offer. Jan, I think, lacked Norman's commitment and passion to build. Jan was as happy imagining his worlds without necessarily having to realize them. When I was invited to make the script for the Foster film, it was talking to the filmmakers, the cameraman, the producer, the director, about the way that you might put that story together. It involved showing up in Manchester, leaving whom, in fact, to the house in which Norman grew up with a film crew. And it was the chance to wander around Manchester City Hall to see the places in which Norman had once worked. Talking about it, he always surprised me a little bit by remembering not the exterior of this great civic monument for Manchester and that golden age of local government. He drew me a picture of the cistern in the water closet with this fascinating glass top to it so you could see the water discharging into the tank. Interesting example of Norman's interest in infrastructure at an early date. And at the same time, I was invited to write a biography of Norman, which was also a fascinating experience. It was the first time I'd attempted biography. It was an attempt, I suppose, to bring Norman alive as a person, as a character, to go beyond the normal architectural story, because I think that his life and his achievements are not only limited to the architectural world in the things that he's touched and had an impact on. And I've always felt it's important to try to make architecture a subject that comes alive for a wider audience. So what I was trying to do with writing about Norman's life was to look at the things that shaped him, the things he made, people he knew, the things that he did. And that was the moment when we actually suddenly one day, after discussing the impact that Buckminster Fuller had had on Norman, the famous moment when Norman flew him in the helicopter to go and look at the Sainsbury Centre, where Fuller turned to him and said, "Norman, how much does your building weigh?" And with a slight adaptation, it's a great title for a film.